Hi, good morning, and thank you for joining me here in Lisbon today in Portugal. I arrived here last night in somewhat of a storm, quite a wild storm that battered the area quite locally and unfortunately caused a bit of damage to some of the buildings around this area of Lisbon where I am and probably wider as well. I wanted to try and give you a bit of a view from high up, so across the top of some parts of the city of Lisbon. I'm looking south here. The main city is off to my right hand side, but you might be able to spot just over my left shoulder there in the distance the sanctuary of Christ the King, or in Portuguese, Santuário de Cristo Rei, and that is a Catholic monument shrine dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ and overlooking the city of Lisbon with its arms outstretched towards Lisbon. It's in the district of Almada, just on the south side, right next to the River Tagus. And it has been there since 1959 when it was inaugurated, and is an expression of gratitude because the Portuguese were spared the direct destructive effects of World War II. Really lovely place to visit, and Lisbon itself is such a lovely city, especially in the summer, to come in and spend some time here. It's really old. The old town is beautiful, fantastic places to eat and socialise, lots of history in the streets, and I hope to get out there when it's not so windy one day and show you some parts of that. Apologies, you might see a rope swinging around behind me as well in the wind just outside the building where I'm sat today at the Corinthia Hotel, a absolutely lovely hotel here in Lisbon. Fantastic facilities, spa, conference facilities, and the rooms are absolutely beautiful. But today I'm going to take the opportunity to enjoy the calm of the inside and read to you chapters 12 and maybe 13 as well of the Sanctuary. So the story is getting improved. We just left Ben having dined with Sir John Pemberley in the hall which he remembered from his school days at Hillcrest, and he had a confrontation with Pemberley about the nature of his projects, but seemed to strike up some sort of relationship with him, and has ended up staying for a couple of nights at his invitation. So let's find out how he gets on. Chapter 12. At the cottage, I said good night to Francis and Joanna, suddenly feeling very weary after the sights of the day, and climbed the stairs to the plain bedroom they pointed me towards. I was exhausted and my hand was throbbing under the bandages, but I lay awake for a while, thinking of Kara. I had to keep a sketch of her now, the one now floating around the island's base in my mind. I even found a plain notebook on a shelf downstairs and started drawing her anew with my right hand. If I could recreate the original, I'd be keeping her with me somehow. Yet no matter what I drew, no matter how many times I turned the page and started again, softened the features with the tips of my fingers, it seemed wrong. She was not there. As I sketched, my mind slipped to the last time Kara and I had spoken. We had only had one conversation on the phone, the whole time she was here on the island. I was in the flat, holding the phone with one hand and twisting the cord with the other, watching the steam rise off my coffee. The year had just begun to turn cold, and Kara had been with Pemberley a month. She had promised she'd phone within a week. I had been preparing angry things to say for another 3. Soon enough, I told her she was abandoning the city, and she replied with anger. You're going to wait there your whole life, hoping things improve, even as you work for the people you have left. You want to stay where you are until you're the last person holding the country together. I'm not the one who's fucked up the country, he says. Did he? Or did he prove a way out for a few people? People who could pay. Let's not pretend it's anything else, darling. He's a billionaire, and every year he grows richer thanks to the underpaid people who services his bloody villages and the wealthy people who buy in. It doesn't matter if he's nice to you. He's bad for the world. That's absurd. I mean it. He wrings everything he can out of the tens of thousands of people on the mainland so he can play emperor with you and the rest of his stuff. Why? He has the willpower to change the world, Ben. You don't understand, and I'm frankly not surprised. He's unique, but I knew you would disapprove. Her voice shook. You disapprove of everything I do because you have the luxury of staying in your studio, painting away, creating art, while I'm out here earning, trying to create something meaningful. It's not fair. It's not fair. At the last word, her voice cracked, but I stayed silent. Ben, you get to work. You get to do the work you love. And even when you think it isn't worthwhile, you're creating something new. When I'm working, it's usually for men who don't care about anything but themselves. But here, the man in charge is trying to do something good. He's built up all his money, he's changed the world, and now he's spending it keeping the world alive. And you still don't approve. I didn't respond for a minute because there was nothing I could say. She was right. I just sat thinking of the phone channel between us, the tiny thread linking me and her, and how nothing was travelling along it. After a while, I heard the sound of the phone being muffled in her hand and footsteps at the other end of the line. Eventually, after some indistinct words, she spoke. Sorry, that was Night Woman again, reminding me of yet another mistake I've made. She sounds difficult. She hates me. Really? She wouldn't let anyone else see it, but I guarantee it. John's slowly appreciating that she's not fully capable of managing the business anymore. He wants someone younger, someone who can run this place for years to come. She started making mistakes, which is why she's trying so hard to criticize me. She's just Mrs. Danvers, really. I wondered how much of this was true and how much was her ambition speaking. So who does that make you? The new Mrs. De Winter? He doesn't fancy me, Ben. He's not even crossed his mind. She sounded so tired of me. Of course, I'm sorry. I wanted to say that I wish she wanted to be with me while she worked, but it had taken all my strength to build up to my earlier challenge, and it had come to nothing. She half answered me with what she said next, though. You know, I've been waiting to find somewhere that might make the world a better place, and this is it. How can one man afford to do that? You've seen the villages, Ben. He's the wealthiest man on the continent, maybe even in the world. The financial affairs are pretty complicated, but that doesn't matter. Angela is in charge of the historical stuff, and I'm helping with what comes next, with the future. Won't she let you in on the past? I've decided not to intrude, unlike everyone else. That's what it's like when you have someone this powerful. Everyone wants something from them. I know I do. What do you want from him? She sounded surprised. I want you to come home to me. She laughed softly. I'll ring again in a week. All right, good night. I added, I love you, but too late, and it seemed probable she hadn't heard it as she moved to hang up the phone. She didn't call again. I woke to the sun streaming through half-closed curtains, my second unfamiliar awakening in 2 days. Somewhere in the roof above me, baby birds were cheeping for their parents. My clothes, my island clothes, were scattered on the floor where I had dropped them. My painter's roll was here, tucked inside the door. Someone must have brought it from the hospital. Apart from the bed, the room contained just a bedside stand, a wardrobe, a chair, and a table. The table's drawer held a fresh bandage for my hand. One of the room's doors led to a tiny bathroom, the other to the rest of the house. Through the window, the north window, I guess from the sun, there was nothing but forest, larches and pines and aspens stretching as far as I could see. The air was warm as I opened the window, and as I unwrapped my old bandage to change it, I heard the cries of birds unknown to me. No planes, no traffic, no swearing, no neighbours. I could be looking out over the world's distant past, or the distant future, when trees had churned the planet's concrete back to powder. The cut across my palm was ugly, and it was uncomfortable to flex. I would soon be able to grip a paintbrush, though, and that was all that mattered. After showering, I remembered my mainland clothes were missing. I thought of who I could ask, the staff at the hospital, maybe? But when I looked in the wardrobe, I found it held more island clothes in the same size as the ones I had been issued yesterday. They would do. What a very mainland concern, I thought, to worry about clothes in a place like this. Then I reminded myself I was from the mainland. I'd be going home soon with Kara. There was a note pushed under the door, a folded square of cream paper. On the front someone had written in a childlike scrawl, "We got this early, hope you see it." Inside was a note in a different hand. It looked educated, but slanted erratically back and forth. It read, "Meetings literally all day, so you'll have to amuse yourself. No more boat crashes, please. You'll be near top table for dinner tonight, but probably not on it. See you afterwards. Enjoy the day. Not one person in a million gets to see this place. Bianca." Beyond the door, a woman's voice was singing an old song, soft and low. Joanna. She was sitting in a chair, folding a pile of clothes, and stopped to look up at me as I came downstairs. "Good morning, Duck." She told me where breakfast could be found, meals provided over the road in a communal kitchen for the 80 or so residents here. She said more about what I might be able to get, but I had been distracted by the layout of the cottage. Almost the whole ground floor was a single large living room. There were 2 armchairs, one on either side of a large fireplace, a few ornaments on the mantelpiece. The walls were covered in cream plaster, interrupted by heavy wooden beams. The room had 2 staircases, each leading only to one bedroom, so there was no way of getting from my staircase to the other bedroom. Does everyone live in houses like these? I wouldn't know, my dear. We've only been to a few hexes since we got here, visiting friends. You know how it is. But this seems pretty standard. No kitchen? No need. We have lots of shared facilities. We call it a library of rooms. Rather than 80 people, each with their own laundry, we have a few machines. Rather than 80 kitchens, we have a hex kitchen. It lowers the costs, the space we need, all of it. Even the walls are bio. Bio? Bio bricks, made from the earth around us. She patted the smooth plaster beside her. Without cement or concrete, just a chemical reaction to produce them. All designed to breathe with the world, she beamed. It sounds very efficient. Mostly it just makes sense. The place is so well insulated we don't even need to use the fire most of the time, even in winter. Imagine that. The only oddity in the cottage was a bulbous section on one side of the downstairs room, clearly a recent addition. It was a study with bookshelves along one side and a desk and chair, squeezed in with a low ottoman. A cold fireplace, clearly ornamental, sat on the outer wall. The desk stood on a Turkish rug, pinning it down at all 4 corners, a curious placement, and there were no books on the shelves. It felt oddly like a city room. Is one of you a writer? She looked across at the study. That, oh Lord, no, not us, that was the last fellow who lived here, Mad Thomas. He sounds interesting. I walked across the extension and examined the bookshelves. This was the room I had stumbled into last night, where I had found the notebook to draw Kara. Every one of the notebooks I picked up was blank. Came here to produce a diary of the year, a guide to the island for residents. Lived with us for a while. This was his main home, but he moved around a lot. Wanted to try every hex. John installed this office for him, trying to make him feel at home. Didn't work. What happened? Poor thing got sick and died. He died? I was able to keep the surprise from my voice. Another death. I thought of the old man in Freybourne, the man whose boat I had taken to get here. His son had died too. William Steenson, that was his name. Joanna's mouth turned downwards as she spoke. Very sad case, Thomas. He was young, not more than 35, I'd say, but he hadn't been happy for a while. She added the last thought brightly, as though it made things better, all things considered. Why was he unhappy? He was a bit touched, if I'm honest. He would ask strange questions like whether he'd ever noticed anything unusual, suspicious. Frank says he was paranoid, but that's not a nice thing to think of anybody, if you ask me. He never liked anyone coming into the office. True, but we all need our spaces, I told Frank, and that's perfectly natural. Did he die in the cottage? I thought of the clothes in my dresser upstairs. Had Thomas been my size? Oh, bless you, darling, no. He was off in hospital for a while before that. What did he die of? Well, whatever it wasn't catching. Doctors give you a really good look over before you come. Make sure you're as clean as possible. We hardly even have the common cold anymore, Francis heard. Wouldn't it be something if we had a world where nobody gets colds and more because we were all here? I agree, it would be something. And they say they were going to be able to do wonderful things with genetics. Make sure we're as healthy as can be from the moment we're born. It's a hard life here. Well, not hard exactly, but sort of tough. Needs your effort and your love each day. But it's like there are all these advantages he's trying to put in. John, I mean, to make things easy along with the hard bits. She gestured to her swollen belly. Do you know what I mean? I did, but I didn't want to know more about Mad Thomas. I did want to know more about Mad Thomas. Who had he been? Sure, I don't know. Dead keen on his work, though. Arrived about a year ago, only lived with us a few months, but he couldn't see this place for what it was. Kept too many thoughts in his head, and then he'd let them out and start upsetting people. Everyone could see he wasn't happy, but it was a shame he got sick. And you definitely don't know what of. I I know what you're thinking. You're worried about infection. She nodded complacently. That bedroom, sharing it, well, don't you worry. They did a sweep of the whole room. Went through all his notebooks too, just in case of any contamination. They said that by the time the next resident got here, there wouldn't be a single fingerprint. That must have been very reassuring. That's how we know Kara. She was in charge of making the hex safe to return to. We had to stay in a hex for over a week with some of the indoor farmers. That's when I was just pregnant. Often how it goes, someone dies and someone gets born. Although we're lucky, most of us are so young. I haven't heard of any other deaths in my time here. Did they bury him here? Oh, I don't know. I didn't go to the funeral. Why not? They said they'd do it privately. Anyway, it wouldn't have been very joyful. When she stood from the chair she had been sitting in, folding, I saw her for the first time how far gone she was, and when I asked, she told me 7 months. Do they have provision here? For babies, I mean. Oh, John, it's very good about babies. Keeps reminding us we all have everything provided. The medical hex is half maternity as far as I can tell. That's what I mean about him doing everything to make us feel safer and happier, you see? I saw. She told me to go and get breakfast over the way, and I did. At this hour, it was still cold enough to see your breath outside. Joanna had been telling the truth about clever insulation of the cottages. This hex consisted of about 40 similar cottages. In the middle was a grass area with a few communal buildings standing on it. One was a long, low canteen with glass walls. Francis was there, sitting at a crowded bench, but when he saw me arrive, he stood and showed me where to queue. The young woman behind the counter greeted me by name. Francis explained that he'd already told her about me. No payment was required. Once I had my tray, thick earthenware mug of tea, plate of eggs and toast, Francis left his friends and sat with me. He was several years younger than me, I could tell, but stronger, more weather-beaten too. His face was almost split in three by a broad moustache, cutting off the lower third, and huge black eyebrows the upper. Beneath his brows, his eyes looked sunken and hollow, like caves under a mossy overhang. All our food is provided. I know what you're thinking. It's probably all stew-like you had last night. It's not. Jo and her lot in the kitchens help keep it varied. It's a marvel what they provide with what we grow. This place is very well thought out. He grinned. Don't be surprised. John spent decades improving his villages on the mainland, and he doesn't even live in them. He spent 2 whole years just working on the design of the hexes, making sure they were right before he started building. And then once he perfected the design, all the homes were done in 6 months. He's a genius. Does he live in one himself? A shake of the head. No, he lives apart in the woods. Helps him think, withdrawing from the place. Sometimes goes missing for a few days, a few weeks even. Then he turns up again with 50 ideas. Makes us jump, I can tell you. I gestured around the room. The lights, the ovens behind the canteen counter. How's this all powered? Mix of things. Solar, wind, and they use the electricity for green hydrogen once they've done that. Don't ask me how, not my line. But there's a grid. Of course there's a grid. How do you think they got the power to cook that lot? He nodded at my plate. It used to be powered by fossils, but John stopped all that over a decade ago. Found it embarrassing, he said, being powered by the dead stuff. Says it's like spending the capital instead of interest. I thought of my schooling and the long dead plants and animals that had paid for it, and I liked Pemberley a little more. Do you see him a lot? He's always around here and there. Did a shift with us in the Arables a couple of months ago. He works on island tasks. Of course he does. Spends a few hours each day, something in the afternoons. Might be in the workshop, keeping the carts going. Might be doing a shift in the design lab. Might just be driving a plough. He loves it here, and he's very particular. Just call him John. He doesn't want Sir. He doesn't want Sir John, least of all. Do you think I could join you for your work today? I hadn't been told what I could and couldn't do with my time while I waited for Cara, and this might show me what life was like here. Either it would be as good as she said in her letters, or I found myself hoping I would see what was wrong with it and persuade her to leave with me. Francis looked at me with polite scepticism. Done any labouring before? Agriculture, I mean? He added the last as though he thought I would be offended at the implication I might have never done a day's physical work in my life. I'm afraid not. What about that? He nodded at my bandaged hand. It probably rules me out of anything very difficult. Then again, I imagine you'd rule me out of anything difficult anyway. He smiled and evidently concluded that politeness trumped utility as far as I was concerned. Suppose you could come along. Not got much technical stuff planned this morning, at least. Yeah, extra pair of hands, very welcome. We went back to the cottage to get ready. I washed quickly at the basin in my little bathroom, and back downstairs noticed an old radio on the shelf. Does this work? Joanna was stowing the laundry in a low pine chest. I think so, my love, but don't tell me if there's anything upsetting. Bad for baby. I turned it on. It was one of the old-fashioned models with a dial, scaling and descending the wavelengths, stopping at outposts of civilization along the way. I found some pop music, and eventually some news, but the words came to me faintly. New Queen. Urged everyone to remain calm. Duration of the difficult period. We'll be introducing measures. The static blew in again like a flurry of snow, and standing in the cottage, watching the lazy motes of dust sinking through the sunlight, I realized it didn't matter too much whether I heard the words or not. Chapter 13. Francis was standing by one of the carts, keeping a space for me. The other seats were filled by more young men and women in practical farming clothes, and they talked to each other in low voices as the cart moved off between the trees. The forest blurred past, and the only sound apart from the whine of the engine and the quiet conversations was the birds chattering above us. Nobody else paid attention as Francis and I talked. He explained that the outdoor and indoor farming operations were completely separate. Outdoor was for grain crops and was designed to produce the maximum yield on a minimum of the island's land. Indoor grew a much broader range, mostly in oxygen-rich tunnels warmed by hydrogen. I still wanted to know more, but he, Pemberley, can't seriously hope to make the island self-sufficient. Surely you couldn't grow everything you need on an island this size. And what about all the stuff you can't grow? I mean, this cart, rubber in the wheels, all the electronics. Francis shrugged. He looks far ahead. He's imported a lot of materials we need in small quantities, for example. A few weeks ago he told us we have everything we need for the next 10,000 years. That's as long a time as has passed since people first started farming over here. And he says we have the resources to live well in that time. I believe him. I asked a couple more questions about the practicalities of life here, with all the skepticism I could express without seeming rude, but he wouldn't be drawn. As we moved, I saw a field covered by an array of translucent gleaming tunnels, tangled like dragon's guts. Francis pointed. The indoor lot. Growing hundreds of species over there. They are no soil. The tubes seemed to be writhing until I realized they were full of figures in similarly pale suits, crawling around inside, looking no larger than weevils. They're the clever end of the game, but nobody's more or less important than anyone else here, apart from John. I was surprised to see Francis' gesture equivocal. He always says he won't be here forever. He knows he will be ready to take over some time. Hey, there's something you won't regret seeing. He pointed to the left, the southwest, and I leaned over to follow his line of his arm. The structure was concrete, but it was coloured a gentle green instead of grey, and the harsh angles of its shape had been softened by the camouflage. It reminded me of ziggurats hidden beneath the rainforest, but this had clearly been built in the last couple of decades, designed to blend in. It must have been 10 stories high, and although oblong at its front, it bent at strange angles as it receded into the forest, so you couldn't easily tell how large it might be. There were no windows. What is it? Seed vault. If there is a plant that grows on this earth, there is enough of it kept in there to restore it to life across the world, if we do it right. It's almost finished too. Got 2 whole hexes of people just logging the things in there, keeping the temperatures right, humidity, soil content, all of it. Every time you hear about a plant going extinct on the mainland, you can be assured John's done his best to bring it here first. I had heard of these things before on the mainland, but for Pemberley to have one of all his own, a second copy of the world, all here, seemed too fantastical to believe. The breadth of his vision thrilled me against my will. Is it just plants? Well, this one is. There's one for animals over on the east coast. Not whole animals, you understand, but tissue samples and so on. He's got almost 2 million species in that one. The cart was slowing now. The road had here undulated in and out, and we let a few people off every 100 meters. Francis and I were the last ones off. We disembarked. We walked down a long tunnel of trees as the cart glided silently away. The valley opened before us, and he pointed out the field we needed to get to. Above us, a bird of prey was gliding back and forth in the sunlight, clear enough to cast a crisp shadow on the ground. What are we doing this morning? Stake banging. Francis explained that we needed to fence off a particular field from another. The banger was a huge metal canister, open at one end with a handle wheel welded on either side. I would hold the stakes at the right point in the ground. Francis would heave up the banger by the handles and hammer the stake home. He was polite enough to pretend he needed the help, and we talked as we went. Is there really enough food for you all here? Nobody's starving, and we hardly bring any from the mainland. You heard John last night. I was so used to the news on the mainland, food imports rising, starvation threatened overseas, food airlifted in as last resort, that the idea of this place being free of such afflictions felt magical. You see, Francis said, grunting as he lifted the banger, the island has an unusually warm climate, bang, so it's suitable for growing crops, bang, and thanks to the tunnels, we're not dependent on outdoor farming anyway, bang. He hauled the canister off, and John says it's only going to get better as the century goes on. We use every efficient varietals, and we don't eat meat. That helps too. It's amazing. We moved on to the next steak hole. I know, right? Right now we're technically in a phase that used to be called the hungry gap. Not that it applies to us anymore. A long time ago, centuries I mean, that was the period when the previous year's fresh food had run out and the new year's hadn't come through yet. No fruits, no autumn vegetables. On the mainland, the gap gets filled with imports from other parts of the world, and you're careful not to ask what happens over there to the people whose food gets carried away. Here we have such a good tunnel system. Doesn't matter what time of year it is. Does anyone ever get sick of life here? Does anyone leave? Can't think of anyone. Immediately I thought of Cara. Why had she left then? Then what of Joanna had told me before I left the cottage this morning? I was hearing about your previous house guest. Oh, Mad Thomas, Francis grimaced. Yeah, he didn't get it. You have to remember, we're all building it. I recalled the phrase from last night, and he didn't. He pursed his lips as if remembering the ingratitude of Thomas. What was he writing? Dunno, he was a difficult customer. Kept claiming he'd help around the house, then disappeared back to his bloody hidey hole to scribble. Stayed up late half the night rearranging the furniture. I don't mind the idea of creative coming here, you understand. Francis had clearly remembered rather too late the nature of my own work. Well, they have to contribute something. And he didn't. Never saw a word of it. More like a poser, if you know what I mean. He had a tattoo of a book on his wrist. Wanted the look all right, but never had the guts to finish the work. But if he had scribbled so much, where had the work gone? Francis finished another steak and heaved the banger onto his shoulder. Anyway, enough on him. What are you here for? I'm waiting for Cara. She'll be coming back soon. She invite you? Not quite. I explained the circumstances, and once I had finished, he turned to me incredulous. You came all this way because she wrote short letters. It wasn't like that. It was hard to explain. It had meant a lot, standing in our flat on the mainland, to receive that note the week before our anniversary. It felt like she'd made a choice. I thought she shouldn't make alone. She wasn't being honest. Do you see now why she might not want to go home? I looked around. The sun was blushing through clouds to our south, and around us the valley was crawling with activity. Some distant figures kneeled in a furrow as if at prayer. There was a quiet hum from a large agricultural machine in one of the bigger fields to my right. I think I understand it better. Probably wasn't anything to do with you. I understand now that the choice I'd been asking her to make, life here or life with me in the crowded, difficult city, was stark. I couldn't see a way of persuading her that city life would be better, even with me, yet the prospect of returning to the flat without her to spend my days painting alone was unbearable. If you ask me, you'd be better off living here together. You never know, John might find a use for you. He did for me. Oh, how so? Francis sighed. What I told you yesterday at dinner about how I came here, it wasn't everything. At the time I was... He waved his hand in a vague, swirling gesture, confused. 5 years ago, I was a very different man. I was 20, servicing a village farm, beets for sugar, but I was drinking. I was fighting. One night I got in the car and nearly killed a villager who'd left the walls for a walk. Where did Pemberley come into it? They fixed up the villager I knocked over, and the Tomorrow Trust told him they would deal with me. They brought me here, to see John, just me and him. He smiled at the memory of being the focus, just for a moment, of Pemberley's attention. He told me I had a choice. I could take my chances with the authorities in the city, and I'd never see daylight again, or I could come here and help him build this place. Francis paused, glanced at my expression, then continued. I know what you're thinking. He helped me to avoid the justice of the land, but I never had much faith in that myself, and he made me into such a better person. And look at me now. John told me the only interesting act of your life is the second one, because that's when you're responding to what you were before. So I owe him my life, and every good thing I do now is because I'm not rotting in some jail or hanged. Redemption on earth. Call it what you like, he saved me. Did you not, I had to be delicate here, have feelings about him or the company before? Why would I? He created these villages. The inequality in your life was thanks to him. He looked blank, so I continued. Pemberley has earned 100 fortunes from those places, and they're impossible to get into unless you're already wealthy. It's the comfortable class pulling up the ladder behind them. I wouldn't have had work if it wasn't for the villages, and we got paid fairly. Do you ever work in one? I worked for the people who lived in them, and I was never very impressed. I didn't think very much of the whole system. Francis shook his head angrily, like I'd released a wasp into it. Clearly we disagree. Let's just leave it at that. I had no desire to seem like another Mad Thomas so early in my stay, so I changed the subject. The other people here, did they all come here from the same way, after incidents like yours? The image occurred to me of an island of escapees, an entire population fleeing mainland justice. Francis laughed at the question, sudden and loud, and kept laughing. Eventually he calmed down and wiped a huge hand across his face. You seen my Joanna? Think she's a criminal, eh? No, I wasn't implying. And your Kara? She run anyone down? No, I suppose not. This isn't a prison island, Ben. Most people here have done wrong in their lives, but that's true of everyone in the world. I imagine yourself included. People end up here in all sorts of ways. Some people are here because they messed up, like me. Some were victims. Some just knew this was where they would feel most at home. Your Kara sounds like one of those people. The only common factor is that it's a place where we can try again. I thought of Kara and wondered why she needed a second start in her life, and I thought of what I had achieved in my own life so far. The Bywaters with their new portrait and the dozens of other paintings of various degrees of dishonesty around the country with my signature in the corner. A thought occurred to me. You need that too. Francis had some more complex tasks he didn't need me for, so he told me to head north. I could make it to the point they called the Southern Summit, the highest point on the lower half of the island, and back if I kept moving. The valley was long behind me now, and I was back among the thick trees, walking up a steep slope. To my left was a face of rock, folded into enormous grey pillows, swathed in a veil of green. There were ferns tucked into any crack they could find, lichens covering huge slabs, and even a hardy tree or two growing from the fissures between the stones. Everywhere life was hammering itself into whatever gaps were available. The road was so narrow here, only one of the island's carts could move along it with ease. I kept my ears open for the sound of a quiet electric whine coming in the opposite direction, in case of accident. Every time I was unsure of myself on a road, I thought of my father. I wished I could have told him about my journey here. He would have approved of the gesture, a daring rescue, an enjoyable tilt at a windmill too large to damage, and therefore safe in some explicable way. He might have thrived here. If anyone needed a second act, it was him. So Pemberley supported lawbreakers, helped them escape their pasts. He had left poor Kevin Ladd's wife so traumatized she had lost her reason at the mention of his name. The old man in Freeborn, Steenson, seemed to hold him responsible for the death of his son. He had wrecked the mainland with his villages, and so the only hope the young had was to serve the old. And yet this place seemed so benign. He had saved the seabirds, created this world, was protecting animals and plants the world would have let die. And Kara had been so happy here. She wasn't the kind to be fooled by easy promises. The summit was clear ahead of me now, and the vegetation had started to shrink from the winds that must whip the island's top. To my left was a winding stair up the rock, and a small wooden sign with the letters South Summit roughly chiselled out. The steps were narrow and slippery. The ill-maintained stones had been worn down by rain, perhaps by feet too. Their age was indeterminate. This place was new and old all in one. Neolithic history, trees planted 2 centuries ago, and the new civilization on top. I wondered which Pemberley valued most. To the south, the hub was a distant matchbox. The Seed, vaulted, was another. The hexes were tiny roulette wheels scattered across the view. I couldn't see the southern coast from here, where I stood. One lone wisp of smoke over to the east suggested something industrial, but I saw no wheels of hexes. In fact, on my tours with Bianca and Francis, the east was the one area I hadn't seen. To the west was a miniature forest of turbines in the sea, as thin as razor blades, and before me to the north the island stretched out, even wilder than the landscape I had left, green and lush. I saw no signs of human life. The only feature of the platform I stood on was a squat monument, a low stone obelisk positioned at the centre. Around the top there was a curved plaque of brass and some Roman numerals, a date from nearly 30 years ago. It said, "We shall inherit the earth." I stood there for some time. All I remember thinking was that I could see why Kara had chosen to come here. Here you could see the world might not be ending. Pemberley had created more than I had ever given him credit for. I remembered that my father's hand had been injured in the accident that killed him. One more thing in common. I peeled off the bandage experimentally. The injury, a long cut stretching from one side of the palm to the other, had mended a little, even since I woke. I left the bandage off. The island air would help me heal. That's the end of chapter 13. So I'll leave it there and come back to you with more readings in the chapters later on. But from Lisbon, where the clouds are coming in again and I can hear the wind howling outside this window, I'll see you next time. Bye.